Hello, everyone. Thank you sincerely for joining, and welcome to today's virtual tour of Gaza, exploring the geopolitics and lived realities of communities living in the besieged Gaza Strip. My name is Erez, and I'm the Communications and Membership Director of the Green Olive Collective, a binational advocacy, information, and tour guiding cooperative committed to a democratic future and an end to the ongoing displacement of Palestinians. We provide communities around the world with insights into the apartheid policies of the occupation and the resources to engage in meaningful solidarity with Palestinians. Your contributions for today's event will go to sustain our work to amplify the voices of human rights defenders and Palestinian communities living under siege, closure, and military rule, to fundamentally shift the landscape of discourse around Israel-Palestine, to advance a robust vision of justice, and to raise local and transnational awareness about the violence of occupation. We need contributions from you, our wider community, in order to cover the costs of our event and sustain future public initiatives in support of human rights. Today, we are asking each of you to contribute and sustain our advocacy by becoming a subscription member of the Green Olive Collective and joining this global community of conscience committed to democracy, equality, and a future free from the violence of ongoing displacement. You can become members at members.greenolivecollective.com/become a member, which I've just put into the chat, and we will donate 10% of all annual membership contributions generated from today's tour to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides healthcare for children in Gaza and is developing a pediatric cardiac surgery program in Khan Yunis in Gaza, truly incredible and critical work, and also to the Human Rights Defenders Fund, HRDF, which provides free legal counsel to human rights defenders engaged in nonviolent opposition to occupation. They provide free counsel to many communities in the South Hebron Hills, defending their lands and rights in endless court cases, and I can truly say from personal experience how very critical and indispensable their work is. Alex Jones, our guide for today's tour, is a partner in the Green Olive Collective, our former vice president, and has been part of our team since 2018. Alex stepped back from his full-time position with Green Olive to join the social impact team at Monday.com. He now helps over 2,000 nonprofits all over the world operate more efficiently, who receive the project and work management software free of charge. He is now also, as of these last weeks, a new parent. So I'm especially glad that he is here with us today and was able miraculously, I would say, to carve out this time for us. He is an experienced and seasoned tour guide focusing on critical histories, alternative geographies, geopolitics, and community life in destinations as diverse as Paris, Barcelona, and Gaza. His repertoire includes experiential programs he developed exploring the anti-fascist history of Spain and the fascinating history of the Hejaz Railway in Ottoman Palestine, which once connected Damascus to Medina and gestures toward a possible future with free travel and open borders in the Middle East. In his work, Alex explores the social epochs of the past to highlight the urgency of the moment we are in today and the need to imagine futures beyond authoritarianism and xenophobia. He has a master's degree in public policy, conflict resolution, and mediation, and I am very glad and thankful he is here with us to shed light and give perspective about contemporary reality in the Gaza Strip and the ways Israeli policy has created a humanitarian and political catastrophe. As many of you know, the Gaza Strip is frequently referred to as an open-air prison and has been under closure since 2007, with almost annual military assaults by Israel and a near total ban on international observers. It is more important than ever for all of us to educate ourselves and bear witness to the systems of violence that permeate daily life in the Gaza Strip. On today's tour, we'll use virtual technology to cross the militarized border zone, visit major historical sites, and imagine a future in which freedom of movement will be guaranteed to all residents of the Gaza Strip. It is important to say that neither Alex nor myself have ever been to the Gaza Strip, nor are we expert political analysts about the history of its development. This virtual tour was developed by the Green Olive Collective and by Alex during the COVID pandemic out of a desire to highlight the ways that the health crisis in Gaza specifically intensified a political and humanitarian catastrophe that was well underway before the pandemic began. At a time when most of us and around the world, people were newly under lockdown, unable to move freely, and could only see each other through virtual technology, Gazans were highlighting the ways this has been the reality in the Strip already for years and years, and called for ongoing solidarity from people around the world. As a tour guiding, advocacy, and education cooperative, Green Olive developed this tour out of a need and desire to heed the call for solidarity coming out of the Gaza Strip and from Gazans, to demystify what is so often made, as I'm sure we're aware here in this room, a huge abstraction and statistical image without real dimensional views. So we wanted to give dimensional views of life in the Strip that are usually less than accessible, and think with our wider community about the ways we can be accountable to Gazans calling for international support and intervention. While the rest of the world has opened up, and for most of us, the days of lockdown are at least beginning to feel distant, the Gaza Strip remains locked to almost everyone except a small number of diplomats, journalists, and aid workers. So I'm really glad that everyone has joined today to visit Gaza virtually and spend the next hour learning about the vibrant communities there. So thank you, Alex, for your time. Really, thank you. It's wonderful to have you here. The last thing I'll say before just passing to you is that as I pass to Alex and the virtual tour begins in earnest, everyone from this moment on should feel free to put questions into the chat or comments. And if you can, before your questions, just write the word question with a dash or colon. I'll look out for it and then collect the questions you all pose to integrate into the question and answer period at the end of this virtual tour. So I wanted to make that note. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Alex. Thank you. You can unmute. You're here.
I am here. Hopefully, okay. Perfect. Thank you very much for hosting today's session, Erez, and thank you for your very generous and flattering introduction. Hi, everybody. Nice to see a few familiar faces in the crowd from previous events, and welcome to anyone who's joining for the first time. As Erez said, my name is Alex, and our mission today is to show both the horrors of what's going on in Gaza and also this other side of what we would love to show you if only we could enter and highlight the rich cultural and historic sites that Gaza has to offer. And we have only 1 hour for today's session, so I want to pack as much as possible in. So I'm going to jump right ahead and begin by sharing my screen with a view which hopefully you can recognize. This is the Eastern Mediterranean. And I want to start by answering a question people often ask me when I said about doing these tours. People ask me, why would anyone want to visit Gaza? Isn't it just a concrete war zone? And I think the first way we can answer that question is by looking at this map. This shows the Fertile Crescent very clearly, roughly from the Nile River along the Eastern Mediterranean and then down through Mesopotamia. And you can see Gaza right at the kind of thinnest point here of the Fertile Crescent. Now, this makes Gaza a really fascinating place throughout history. Any great military leader or empire that wanted to control the Middle East had to control Gaza. And because of that, they've all left their marks on this place. Everyone from Alexander the Great to Saladin to Napoleon. It's also an ancient port. If we zoom in a bit closer, you can already see here the ancient port city of Gaza. And it's kind of the first port you come to when transporting goods through the desert. So it was the port of the Nabateans, who had an incredible spice network coming from places like Hegra in modern-day Saudi Arabia, through Petra in modern-day Jordan, all the way here to the coast. And then from the Nabateans, basically all the great empires who have ruled this part of the world have, left their mark in Gaza, as we said. Everyone from the Romans to the Byzantines, to various Arab rulers, Mamluks, Ottomans, the British, led by Australian and New Zealand troops, conquered in the First World War, and then the modern day, which we'll jump into talking in a bit more detail, sharing between Egyptian and Israeli domination of the local people. When we talk about Gaza, we talk first about Gaza City, which is roughly here. But we also talk about the Gaza Strip, which you can see quite clearly without me adding any effects to this map. The Gaza Strip, it should be stressed, is a completely unnatural creation. For most of that history we talked about, Gaza was a port city connected to all of its surrounding territories. The Strip exists only since, let's say, 1948, which was the war in which Israel gained its independence, called Milchemet Ha'atzmaut by the Israelis. Of course, to Palestinians, this is the Nakba, the catastrophe. And this completely transforms this area. Not only do we have, for the first time, this strip of land around Gaza demarked, we also have a huge influx of refugees. Population of Gaza before the war was approximately 90,000 people. After the war, this increases to 200,000 people. These are refugees mostly from these coastal regions north of Gaza, but also some from the inland areas here who are fleeing their villages being attacked, depopulated, and general ethnic cleansing of this area. People seeking safety here. And this issue of refugees has been a huge kind of mark, I think, on Gaza all the way through to today. That ratio more or less continues to this day. About 75% of Gaza's modern day population of just over 2 million are descendants of these refugees. And uniquely, these refugees have this refugee status. This is a hereditary status. So yeah, over 1.5 million refugees in Gaza today are officially recognized as such. What we're going to do next is try and enter the Gaza Strip. We have a little bit of background now. How could we kind of get into this place? Let me just share my screen here. Hopefully you can all see this video. And we're going to first try and enter from the Israeli side. If you know any internationals who have been to Gaza, perhaps we have some in the audience today, as Erez said, unfortunately, myself and Erez has never been so lucky. This is the way they're most likely to have gone through. You can see a couple of aid workers here entering the Erez terminal. It's incredibly difficult for an international to enter Gaza. A few dozen aid workers, journalists, and maybe diplomats every month, and that's about it. Of course, nothing compares to how difficult it is for the Palestinians to leave the Erez crossing. But once you have all the permits and you've gone through the terminal, you enter into this kind of barricaded tunnel, which is several hundred meters long. So long, in fact, there's a couple of resourceful Palestinian guys on mopeds who will drive you the length of this tunnel, all, of course, in the name of security by the Israeli occupation. The Erez terminal is absolutely enormous. It was built after the Second Intifada. If anyone's traveled through the West Bank, maybe you've been to similar kind of terminals or crossings in places like Ramallah, with the Kalandia checkpoint, or the 300 checkpoint in Bethlehem. The idea was that this will become a hub for Palestinian workers to enter Israel with permits and security checks, of course. It will be basically a source for very, very cheap income, very, very cheap labor for the Israelis. They built this enormous facility capable of processing 1 million people to enter every single month. Now, that has never come close to being used. And in fact, this place is almost empty most of the time. You can hang around outside on the Israeli side of the Erez terminal, as I've done, and as many of our tourists have done on our physical Gaza border tour, and chat to some of the people who are coming through this crossing and discuss, who are you, how did you get this permit? We talked about the internationals coming in. How about the Palestinians coming out? There are three main categories of permit you can apply for to exit the Gaza Strip. Each one incredibly difficult and incredibly rare to be issued. The most common is what they call the merchant permit. And the idea is that this is for businessmen who want to do business, buy and sell goods mostly in Israel, but mostly in the West Bank. It seems to be pretty much an open secret that most of these merchants are not really buying and selling goods per se. They're mostly kind of day workers, laborers, agricultural workers in Israel proper, and coming back and forth. This permit is very difficult for them to obtain, not only from the Israeli side, but also from the PA and Hamas side as well. All three of these groups need to be kind of coordinating for these permits to be issued. And there's a huge amount of pressure on people who do get these permits, not necessarily to spy in a kind of formal way. Here we are arriving at the end now of the terminal, but to maybe just pass on information. It's a very rare privilege to be able to cross, and so it's a very risky permit to obtain, as well as a very difficult one. We'll jump back to the map now, and we can see what we just saw from above. We'll zoom in to the Erez crossing from space. And as this loads, you can see, first of all, the enormous terminal building here, and then that long concrete tunnel that we just passed through. Here we can see a graph which shows how many people we're actually talking about here. As you can see, recently, actually, these numbers have just had a little bit of a spike. They have issued about 20,000 additional permits of this merchant permit type. And the average over the past year has been about 40,000 exits per month. That might seem like a fair amount. Keep in mind, the facility was built to process 1 million people a month, and the population of Gaza is over 2 million people. The vast majority of Gazans have never left Gaza and are unable to leave Gaza. Gaza has a very young population. In fact, the majority of Gazans are under 18. So the majority of Gazans know no other reality than the siege. So they know only this current existence. The other two permit types that we can see here are in the light color on the top, patients and their companions. There is such a thing as a permit for people who are very ill to seek medical treatment, again, either abroad, the West Bank, or most typically East Jerusalem. And they can apply for permits to follow for their companions or parents, in some cases, to join them. Some Israelis maybe kind of point this out as a sign of great humanity, that they allow this treatment to take place for those who can't receive this treatment inside Gaza. But the majority of these permit applications are actually denied. Even a majority of those who are deemed acceptable for security reasons are also denied. About, on average this year, 2 people with life-threatening illnesses every single day have been denied from coming through the Erez crossing to seek medical treatment. So all these numbers need to be taken with, a bit of context. And then there is this sort of other permit which you can apply for in very rare occasions. If you, for example, win a scholarship to study abroad, there is a facility to apply for this permit to study abroad and leave the Gaza Strip, but it's incredibly, incredibly rare, and you can see it amounts usually to just a handful of cases every day. I also wanted to point out how sporadic this is. This changes all the time. The permits are withdrawn almost at whim. You can see, from 1 month it's almost down at 20,000, spiking to 40,000. It's very difficult to make plans. Certainly, it's difficult to do business in this way to feed your family. And if something occurs, like, for example, in 2021 and 2020, for example, here we have the coronavirus outbreak, these permits are likely to be revoked, and at the snap of a finger, this can reduce to zero or almost zero. So the permits are a huge, huge burden, even for those who have them. 2 more things we can see from here before we move on. I've also added this yellow line next to the official armistice line, which is in green here. The green line marks the border, if you like, although it's not really a border between 2 sovereign states. This yellow line marks 300 meters from that border. This is an area which the Israeli army has unilaterally declared an access restricted area, or ARA, meaning no one's allowed to enter this area without coordination with the army. Now, it's almost impossible to coordinate a visit into this area. In practice, the only things that are allowed to exist in this area are agricultural lands, fields, but it's very, very difficult for the farmers to actually tend their crops in this area. There have been many, many cases of people being shot at, even killed, for innocently entering this area. And then, of course, there have been violent and non-violent protests at the border fence, which we can talk about perhaps later on. But as you zoom out, you'll see quite quickly how densely populated the Gaza Strip is. So this very thin area around the border, this ARA, makes up, would you believe, about 30% of all of Gaza's fertile agricultural land. So the fact that this huge chunk is just like that called off limits is a huge shock to the very strained already agricultural industry of Gaza. Then the other thing we can see here is two Israeli settlements. One is the Israeli moshav or town of, you can see here, Nativ HaSara, which is a small town which comes almost up to the border fence. And then just on the other side of the border fence, here in the sand, you can actually see the ruins of one of the former Israeli settlements. You can actually zoom in and see, the cul-de-sacs of where these little suburban homes used to be. Now, Israel conquers the Gaza Strip in 1967. And throughout the 1970s, they build settlements in the Gaza Strip, much the same way they did in the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. There were 19 settlements founded in the Gaza Strip. There were about 9,000 people living there up until 2005. In August 2005, we share a new video. One second, I apologize. Here we go. Let's see this video now. In August 2005, the Israeli government made the unilateral decision to pull these settlers out of the Gaza Strip, whether they liked it or not. And this was a very controversial issue within Israeli society. About 2/3 of the population, according to most opinion polls, supported the government's decision to withdraw. The ones who didn't donned these orange shirts as the kind of color of the movement. And there were very dramatic scenes, as you can see here, of the settlers forcibly being removed from their homes, arguing with the soldiers. This was an image that was beamed around the television screens of Israelis. And I think it had a very lasting impact, not only on the Israeli settler movement, but also on Israeli society at large. The Israeli Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister who made this decision was none other than Ariel Sharon, one of the kind of figureheads of the right-wing movement, certainly of the settler movement. And the fact that he himself decided to withdraw these settlers was a huge shock. But many people, and I would support this theory, have argued this was some sort of gambit on his behalf. Today, the idea of withdrawing settlements, any settlements, for example, in the West Bank, is almost a consensus issue across Israeli society. Most Israelis say this should not happen. Any discussion of peace, of land swaps, whatever it might be, almost unanimously, the Israeli public at large say withdrawing settlements is not a good idea. And this is a huge reason why. Stop the screen share and come back to our Google Earth view. I think the trauma of withdrawing from Gaza for Israelis was very much, viscerally felt. And today, I think the landscape around perhaps, changes being made to the more symbolic settlements in the West Bank would be very, very difficult to imagine. Of course, when Israel withdrew the settlers from the Gaza Strip, they claimed they have fully withdrawn from Gaza, and as such, have no responsibility as an occupying power in the Gaza Strip anymore. Now, this is demonstratively false. Israel still controls everything that comes in and out of Gaza, the land space, the airspace, the water space, the airspace, you name it. But because the settlers were withdrawn, this is kind of the claim of the Israeli government. So the settlement issue is very important, I believe, for those two reasons. But let's leave the settlers for now, and we're going to try still to get into Gaza. We haven't managed yet to even start our tour. We didn't get in through the Erez crossing. We weren't a diplomat or an aid worker or a journalist. So maybe we could try flying in instead. Well, there is an airport in Gaza, or maybe I should more correctly say there was an airport in Gaza. Yasser Arafat International, down here in the south of the Strip, was opened in the early 2000s, in the heady days of the Oslo Accords, when there was huge optimism around prospects of peace. And there was an idea that Gaza would be developed as this kind of Mediterranean Riviera of the Arab world. The airport was opened, as you see here, by Arafat and Bill Clinton to great fanfare. A couple of flights were successfully held in this airport. But then the Second Intifada breaks out, and Israel bombs this airport multiple times. And since then, any of the resources, buildings, materials of the airport have been taken and reused for rebuilding buildings in the rest of Gaza. So the airport today is completely unusable. So we still need to find a way to get in. And if you're eagle-eyed, you might have noticed that down here at the south of the Gaza airport, or what remains of it, there's another huge crossing between Israel and Gaza. This building is the Kerem Shalom crossing. Now let's have a look at another video while we discuss Kerem Shalom. So the Kerem Shalom crossing is the only other crossing other than Erez that we saw at the beginning, which has remained open between Israel and Gaza. However, the Kerem Shalom crossing is not a person crossing, not a human crossing at all. There is no one who can cross through the Kerem Shalom crossing. The only things that cross through the Kerem Shalom crossing are goods. Everything which comes in or out of Gaza has to first be approved by COGAT, which is the Israeli military civilian affairs group. Now, I'm fortunate enough, if you want to call it fortunate enough, to have met the former head of COGAT at a talk he once gave. And I asked him the question, how do you decide what things are allowed in or out of Gaza? In terms of the food, first of all, which is allowed in, he was very honest and quite blunt about how this categorization is made. It's really a question of calories. They want to decide how many calories are required to keep the population of Gaza basically alive, completely repressed, but not sort of starving enough to completely rebel or explode the situation. So the goods that are allowed in are incredibly restricted. Even, the United Nations, who have a huge presence in Gaza through the guise of bodies like UNRWA, the body responsible for helping Palestinian refugees, have to have their goods approved by the Israelis. And some goods are allowed to be exported from Gaza. This also must be done with the approval of the Israeli army. It's very arbitrary. For many years, things like chocolate was banned with no explanation why. Coriander was also. In terms of exports, for many years, strawberries and aubergines, eggplants, were allowed to be exported, but almost no other agricultural crops. It's completely crazy. Also, there's a huge restriction on what Israel considers to be dual-use materials. That's to say, anything which could have a civilian, but also a military use. So things like concrete, for example, which can be used for rebuilding, desperately needed for rebuilding buildings which have been destroyed in the several dozen Israeli airstrikes over various military operations. This is restricted because it could also, of course, be used for building bunkers or tunnels. Same thing with vehicles, communications equipment. All of this is restricted. The Kerem Shalom crossing is also, as you see here with these backed up trucks, an incredibly inefficient place. If you are trying to do business as a Gazan, exporting, let's say, agricultural goods to the West Bank, it's a very slow process. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of permits. None of the vehicles can actually cross between the two. So goods are unloaded, the trucks will unload back to back. Oftentimes the goods will sit outside in the hot sun. There's no kind of facilities there to keep them refrigerated. So by the time the goods arrive in the markets of Israel or the West Bank, it's very difficult for them to be competitive. I can also show you some statistics of, jump back to our Google spreadsheet, Google slideshow, of how many truckloads are allowed in and out. And you can see, just like in the previous graphs at Erez, things are spiking up and down all over the place. This is 2023. You can see down to as low as 4,000 trucks in September 2022. And again, in our Corona days, there's a big dip as well. Very recently, there was a allegation that the Israelis found explosives in a truck which was coming out of Gaza, and also from a shipment of furniture, which was supposed to be going into Gaza. And because of that, the Kerem Shalom crossing was completely shut for several weeks. This is collective punishment, completely illegal under international law, not to mention immoral. But this sort of thing happens all the time. If anything suspicious is found, the Kerem Shalom crossing can close again, just like that. So that's Kerem Shalom. We still haven't got in. We could perhaps try to enter the Gaza Strip here at the Rafah crossing. The Rafah crossing is the only crossing between Gaza and Egypt. Right? Gaza does have a border with Egypt. And this crossing is also very difficult to cross. The security is perhaps a little less intense than at Erez, but the Egyptian policy towards Gaza is, today at least, very similar to the Israeli one. And the chances of getting permits here are also very, very, very slim. For internationals, almost impossible. We can see, for example, let's just see here, the numbers of people who are crossing through the Rafah crossing. But one thing that you must keep in mind at the Rafah crossing is that it depends greatly on the Egyptian policies of the day. Right? Today, the Egyptian government is, like I said, quite closely aligned to Israel in terms of its security policy and its relationship with Hamas. But previously, that's not always been the case. Right? We had the Muslim Brotherhood briefly in charge in Egypt in the last decade during one of the Egyptian revolutions after the overthrow of Mubarak. And Hamas really is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So during this time, things were very open. A lot of goods were brought in and out, and Hamas were greatly bolstered. However, that's not the case today, and Hamas is really, completely under siege from both sides, Israel and Egypt. Okay, perhaps we could try to get in, not through land or air. There's this 40-kilometer long coast in Gaza, and perhaps we could try to get through this way. This yellow square I've drawn on this map shows us the 20 nautical mile free shipping zone, which the Israelis in the Oslo Accords signed that Gaza would have. Right, this should be free for Gazan fishermen, Gazan boats to come and go. However, not for one single day of the existence of the Oslo Accords have the Israeli Navy allowed this to take place. Instead, the exclusion zone changes almost at the whims of the individuals in the Israeli Navy. One day it can be 10 nautical miles, another it could be 3. There's also an exclusion zone around the edge. Things are jumping around all the time. It's impossible for the Gazan fishermen to plan, and it's impossible for boats to come in or out through the Gazan port. Let's zoom into the Gazan port now and take a look at it. Because one thing which, whenever you talk to Gazans, they never fail to mention is their pride of being on the sea. Right? Remember that for 3.5, nearly 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank, they have no access to the coast, and many of them have never seen the sea. So for Gazans, this beautiful port is a source of great pride, and it is one place where they can come, jump in the sea and feel perhaps a bit of freedom. I think the port is very picturesque. We've got these beautiful little fishing boats, but again, remember that politics touches every part of life here. These are the same fishermen who are being shot at in the open waters when they cross this very poorly defined and impossible to mark in the middle of the open ocean restriction that the Israeli Navy may have set from one day to the next. So there's, again, endless cases of Gazan fishermen being shot out at sea, Gazan boats being damaged. It's really, really dangerous. And it also has this terrible kind of follow-on effect for the environment, because the Gazan fishermen are only fishing in this coastal area now. And this is the area where the youngest fish live. You don't get very good catches there. So the fish stocks are being depleted. Their hauls are greatly reduced. So it's all just kind of compounding one thing on the next. Now, if we move to the other side of the marina, of the port, we see an interesting memorial here. This is a memorial to the Mavi Mara, which was a ship which led a flotilla of boats, which sailed from Turkey to Gaza, and was protesting the Israeli siege in 2010. the Israeli Navy intercepted this boat out at sea, somewhere out here. And there was a violent struggle. 9 people were killed. The boat never made it to Gaza. And I think this is kind of a symbol of how really, complete this blockade is. It really is impossible to get in and out of the Gazan port. But this memorial here is a testimony to those activists who tried. Behind it, we can see some of the high-rise buildings of the Gazan port area. And you can see here 2 interesting buildings. You can note this one with the glass in kind of cream color. This is the Al-Hanadi Tower. This is one of the residential towers which was bombed in May 2021. This was the last, big escalation of violence between Hamas and the Israeli army. There was never any official reason given by the Israeli Air Force for why this building was destroyed. It's a kind of upper-class apartment block, but this building simply no longer exists today. And in front of it here, we have a construction site. Now, this is the construction site of a beautiful mosque called the Al-Husayna Mosque, which was funded by the Turkish government. And we can, with the power of virtual tours, see the before and after. This is how the mosque looks today. It's finished, beautiful gleaming white mosque, actually modeled on the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. We can even now go inside the mosque and see for ourselves how things look. So we can go up to the top where you see, again, this beautiful dome. Let me just wait for the pixelation to clear up. These roundels are Quranic inscriptions, again, inspired by what you see in the Hagia Sophia, if anyone's been to Istanbul. You can also look around at the huge embroidered carpet with the spaces for people to pray. In Ramadan, this will be completely full. And here is the Qibla wall showing the direction of prayer towards Mecca. Now from here, we're going to zoom out a little bit from the port. We're just going to imagine that somehow we managed to get through the blockade, and we're going to go inland up here to the old town of Gaza. To do that, I have another video which I'm going to share with you. So let's take a look at this one. And we'll join the drone taking off at the bottom of Omar Mukhtar Boulevard. So we're heading inland, heading east. It's early in the morning. The sun is just rising. People are just waking up. And this is one of the most beautiful boulevards, I think, in Gaza, from all the research I've done and the people that I've spoken with. And it runs through the Rimal neighborhood, which is quite a upmarket neighborhood in the middle of Gaza City. A lot of important kind of administrative buildings are here. We have the Palestinian National Assembly here, the National Library here. And this area at the bottom has this kind of green area in the middle, which is used for, celebrations, especially in the month of Ramadan. This is where there'll be lots of people selling, candies and sweets. Sometimes there's fun fairs down here, this kind of thing. But of course, buildings in this neighborhood are also likely to be targeted and bombed. For example, this tower, which we're approaching here, is a real landmark of Gaza. This is the tower which was bombed, you may remember, also in May 2021. This housed the headquarters of many international broadcasting agencies, including Al Jazeera. Again, the Israeli Air Force didn't give any official reason for why a residential and journalistic tower would be targeted, but this tower here on our right-hand side was wiped off the map after 3 missile strikes and no longer exists. We also have a video, perhaps I can show you if we have time, of this missile strike, if anybody's interested to see this huge building just destroyed in the blink of an eye. If anyone has been to this part of the world, maybe you visited Jaffa, where today you can travel along Jerusalem Boulevard, as it's now known. Previously, it was known as Jamal Pasha Boulevard, as, by the way, was this boulevard. Both these boulevards, one we're looking at here in Gaza and Jerusalem Boulevard in Jaffa, were built in the same year, 1915, by the same Ottoman governor, and restored and reworked by the same British architect. So a lot of kind of similarities there between the two. All right. So now we've arrived at the edge of the old town. Let's jump back here to take a look at some of the buildings inside the old town itself. So this is where that kind of historic core of old Gaza City is. And in the very center, we have here the first building I want to show you, the Kashr al-Basha. And to show you this video, I have enlisted the help of two extremely cute little tour guides who are going to take us for a quick look at this building. Erez, you'll tell me if you can hear the sound clearly.
من فيديو جديد مع قناة شاهد اليوم لما كان قديم كثير
This is in Arabic, but I can do my best to translate from my very limited Arabic. They simply said, welcome to a new video. We're going to show you this building. It's called the Kashr al-Basha.
في الفترة الظاهرة
Very cool tour guide to have a full series.
السابع للهجرة استخدم المبنى كمركز للاحتلال البريطاني.
A full series on YouTube.
من يقدم بعد هزيمته في عكا.
So this building was built as a kind of administrative residence by the Ottoman Sultan, Mamluk Sultan, sorry, Baybars in the 13th century. Served as a police station, as a school, it's now a museum. Napoleon himself spent 3 nights here when he conquered Gaza on his way to the big battle he fought in Akka.
وأيضا استخدم كمبنى لإدارة مدرسة الأمير في ريال خلال الإدارة المصرية. اطلقوا عليها عدة أسماء ومنها قطر الباشا ودار السعادة والسرايا. استخدمت مباني القصر كإدارة لمدرسة الزهراء الثانوية للبنات. إن شاء الله تكونوا استمتعتوا بهذا الفيديو، وقبل ما نقولكم باي ما تنسوا تضغطوا على زر السبسكرايب الأحمر وتشغلوا الجرس لحتى يصلكم كل فيديو إحنا بنعمله وبس. باي.
As I said, it's had many different names throughout history. Kasr al-Basha is literally like the castle of the Pasha, which is like the Ottoman ruler, also been known as the Saraya, you'll find dotted throughout the country. And then, of course, at the end, I think everyone can understand, like and subscribe. They have a great channel on YouTube if you want to follow more of their stuff. And as often is the case, between the kind of administrative building, which is this one, we also have the main building for, here's a picture of it, for religious control. So we have the next site on our tour. Next door to it is the Omari Mosque, the great mosque of Jaffa. Here you can see the typical Mamluk era kind of arches, the big minaret here in this beautiful courtyard. And this is a really ancient building as well. Although the mosque itself dates from the 13th century, there's always things being added. You can see more construction here going on. There is actually a legend which says this is the temple, if anyone's up with their biblical history, and the story of Samson and Delilah, which he destroys. Gaza was an important Philistine city in the biblical era, but it was also a church in the Crusader era. Here you can see a picture of this building actually in ruins in the First World War, but you can see very clearly how it looks like a church built by the Crusaders here. This was actually damaged by Anzac troops. Oftentimes people ask me as a New Zealander, like, what on earth do you have in any way connecting you to this place? And I'm afraid to say that it was the New Zealanders who first conquered this place and kind of brought Western, imperialism and colonialism to Gaza. So I feel at least somewhat responsible, at least for my ancestors' deeds here. And speaking of churches, on the other side of the street from the Omari Mosque, we do find one of 3 remaining churches in Gaza. This is a Byzantine era, 4th century, Greek Orthodox church dedicated to Saint Porphyrius, who was the first Christian bishop of Gaza. He's buried in the crypt. There is, believe it or not, a very small Christian community inside Gaza today. Population is 99% Muslim, and Hamas is, let's not kid ourselves, an authoritarian government ruling with a pretty iron fist, but there is freedom of worship, at least officially. There are 900 Christians still living inside Gaza, and this is one of the churches where they can worship. I would love to be able to visit this church and to be able to show it to you in real life, but for now we'll make do with a virtual tour. These colors really do look incredible. And from the old town, you can see the remains of the old city wall here. We can also see a few interesting landmarks. We can see a big street running right through the middle of the strip. This is the main north-south highway. It's called Salahuddin Street. But this is actually part of the ancient Roman Via Maris, which ran all the way along the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean. And on the other side of that, we have the neighborhood here of Shuja'iyya, which is a densely populated neighborhood going from that street almost all the way up to the Israeli border fence. And this is an area which has suffered some of the worst damage in various bombing attacks. I'd love to show you a video here. Of how much damage Shuja'iyya has suffered. Put it on 2x speed because there is a lot of damage to be seen. This is filmed after the 2014 operation, as the Israelis call it, called Cast Lead, which saw troops on the ground and huge amount of destruction raining down from the air. This is again a very densely populated, civilian neighborhood. And a huge number of these buildings have been unable to be rebuilt because of the ban on importation of things like concrete. So Shuja'iyya is still in a very, very rough shape. And it's also right on the border fence with Gaza and Israel. So oftentimes when protests happen, this is the area which, bears the brunt of any clashes. But I think this kind of footage is just absolutely shocking to see how, the scope and scale of the destruction. And you can imagine the trauma of living through something like this. It's really almost impossible to imagine for someone like myself who's lucky enough to never have lived through something like this. And as we zoom out here, you can see just how close we are to the edge. This is already the Israeli border fence right here at the edge of Shuja'iyya. Okay, my friends, so we are almost done with our whistle-stop tour of the Gaza Strip. I do want to allow some time for questions. I hope Erez doesn't mind that I've gone a little bit over my allotted time.
Please continue.
Just quickly jump in to show you the look of one of the refugee camps in Gaza, because we did talk about the huge number of refugees living in Gaza. This is the Jabalia refugee camp, which is in the north part of the Gaza Strip. It's the biggest of the 9 UNRWA, United Nations run refugee camps. You can see not tents. Of course, the refugees have been living here since 1948, so the structures are a little bit more permanent now. But if anyone has been on Green Olive tours with us, maybe you visited Aida camp in Bethlehem or the Balata camp in Nablus, things look fairly similar, but the living conditions are very, very difficult, incredibly crowded, very limited electricity. Gaza has approximately, let's say, 50% at best of its electricity needs. So there are rolling blackouts when it comes to electricity. If we have any questions about electricity, I'd be happy to talk about electricity more later on, but the electricity needs of Gaza are simply not being met. People do not have enough power. Similarly, water, you'll maybe recognize these black tanks, which you see all over the West Bank as well, simply because the water supply is not reliable. There used to be there still is, a coastal aquifer running underneath the Gaza Strip, but overuse has led to this water being poisoned. As recently as the 1990s, almost everyone in Gaza had clean drinking water in their taps, but nowadays almost all the water has to be bought because the water is so bad. It's also becoming brackish and salty, and it's just not safe to drink. You can also see unsanitary conditions with sewage and that kind of thing, just lying in the streets. Because of the electricity problems, there's not enough electricity to run the sewage treatment plants. This is also exacerbated by the Israeli army, who have bombed the electricity power plant on multiple occasions. So something like 50 Olympic swimming pools worth of raw sewage is dumped every day into the Mediterranean Sea, which is just an absolute, humanitarian and environmental disaster. It's really, really awful. So this is the conditions of life in the middle of a refugee camp. And this is, I think we will finish our tour today at the Gaza power plant itself. There is but one power plant in the entire Gaza Strip. It's mostly actually funded by the government of Qatar today. The Qataris are oftentimes bringing in literally suitcases full of cash through the Rafah crossing just to keep the Hamas government kind of functioning. And they are paying for the transfer of diesel fuel through Kerem Shalom crossing to run this power plant. But you can see here the shortages of power that the people in the Gaza Strip are suffering from. At the very best, they might be getting about 13 hours of power per day. And this affects everyone. This affects schools, this affects hospitals, this affects education, this affects business. The power is really, I think, at the core of everything which goes on in Gaza, and really contributes in such a tragic way to the massive humanitarian crisis which is going on there. It's a bit of a sad note to kind of finish my presentation on, but I definitely want to try and leave some time for questions. So I think I'm going to pause there. Thank you all very, very much for taking time out of your days and busy lives to join this session and engaging with such a really tragic and avoidable humanitarian crisis. So I'll thank you and throw it over to you, Erez, for any questions that we might have.
Thanks, Alex. Incredible. I really appreciated the ways that you touched on different facets of Israeli control and how it affects community life in Gaza, how you touched on the severity of the impact of the permit regime on the population of Gaza, and the ways that Israeli control over who enters and exits conditions life. And also the way you touched on the larger political strategy of Israel and the political gambits being made. I think so importantly, we have to touch on the ways that so much of the logic of the ongoing Nakba and the occupation is one of division, segregation, and separation. So a huge part of the siege of Gaza and blockade, it stops people also from going to the West Bank from Gaza and vice versa. Family unification is a huge issue. But what this really means in the larger scope is that Israel is continuing to fragment Palestinian society. It's aimed strategically and as a military also project is to fragment Palestinian economic, cultural, social, and political life so that a future Palestinian state and independent self-determination is not possible. And that's also part of the gambit playing out. There've been wonderful questions in the chat. I wanted to, because we're a little short of time, I think I'll unfortunately ask on people's behalf. But there was a question from Grace who asked, when Palestinians fled to Gaza in 1948, why was that a safe space? And why did Israel not attack Gaza at that time? I was curious if you had any thoughts or can explicate a little bit about what the dynamics were.
Great question. Thank you very much, Grace. Yeah, I think it's important to say that Gaza is not the only place Palestinians fled to, right? I think any kind of big Palestinian or Arab majority place, city in the region saw an influx of refugees. So whether that was Gaza or Jerusalem, the east side, people fled as well into neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but also Arab majority cities inside Israel, places like Nazareth. Nobody knew where the borders would end up being. So I think mostly the people in the small towns and the villages went to the nearest big city in terms of the fleeing, and then there were the more active depopulations. So all along that coast, from sort of Tel Aviv south, places like Majdal, which becomes Ashkelon today, Isdod, which becomes Ashdod. These are actively depopulated by Israeli military groups, paramilitary groups in many cases, and they're kind of forced down the coast into Gaza. And also it was kind of abutting Egypt. So I think there was an idea perhaps that it would go, the problem, as the Israeli army may see it, would go into Egypt. The Egyptians never fully annexed Gaza because they were refugees. They were mostly quite poor, mostly quite uneducated in many cases, and they didn't want to take this kind of burden on, I think, and risk having these people in their having these people in the streets of Cairo, perhaps protesting. Egypt was already a delicate place. I think that's what kind of keeps Gaza as this sort of strange in between, that it was never fully annexed by either Israel or Egypt, and it kind of continues this perpetuated issue of the statelessness of the refugees.
Right, but was under Egyptian control until 1967. So that's also why people went there, of course, just as a basic contours of the dynamics. And this follows into, nicely dovetails with questions from Uri in the audience participating in the tour, who also asked about the dynamics with Egypt. He said, please cover the Egypt crossing as well. Many people believe that Gazans always have that option regardless of what Israel does. Also asked, does Israel influence Rafah crossing policies? You did touch on it, of course, in the tour, but I just thought I'd ask, following the question, if you have any other information to share about what the political dynamics between Israel and Egypt are, what's Egypt's strategic or various interests and the different dynamics of that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is often used as this kind of almost excuse. The Israeli security establishment will often say, lefties like us are crazy for saying it's under siege. How could it possibly be under siege, Gaza, when it borders Egypt? There's this other crossing there, and they can come and go. Why are they complaining? We control our borders with all of our neighbors. We can't control what happens there, but that's just not the case. Israel does have a huge influence over what happens at Rafah. The global geopolitics of where Egypt is aligned currently means that they're incredibly dependent on this alignment with the kind of global West, alignment with the USA, the alignment with Saudi Arabia, and therefore the alignment, at least kind of strategically, with Israel. So I don't think that the Rafah crossing is literally controlled by Israel in the sense that the permits aren't being applied to the Israeli army, but in a more general sense, I think Israel knows exactly what goes on in the Rafah crossing, and they were very, very nervous about the lack of control during that brief period when the Muslim Brotherhood were in charge. There was a huge number of tunnels dug under that only 10-kilometer long border during that time, when all sorts of things were being smuggled in, from weapons to basic humanitarian goods and food. But I think that Israel really felt that lack of control, and since then has made very, very sure that in a sort of bigger geopolitical sort of understanding of things, they've been able to influence the Egyptian policy there. And it should be said, maybe the final thing I'll say, once you cross through the Rafah crossing, it's not like you're home and dry. I have a friend who managed to cross through the Rafah crossing. The north part of Egypt is also still fairly lawless place. He said that the bus didn't stop for bathroom breaks from there to Cairo. They just put the foot down and gunned it through the desert because there's a huge militant presence there as well. So the Egyptian army is very active there trying to control this, and the Egyptian army and the Israeli army are today working very closely in tandem. There's even been Israeli bombing raids in North Sinai with full Egyptian cooperation and complicity. So they are very closely aligned militarily and strategically.
Fair and important perspective. Because we have just a few more minutes left, I guess I wanted to actually just pass it to you again, Alex, and ask, was there anything in this tour? It was quite comprehensive, shockingly so for the time we had, but not everything could be covered. I guess I just wanted to ask if there's anything that you think people who want to learn more should really investigate to understand the reality on the ground in Gaza, if there's any aspects of community life you find particularly interesting or vibrant that you want to highlight. Just for any last thoughts and topics.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's like what are two white guys from the global north going to have to do about Gaza? And oftentimes Gaza is kind of reduced to numbers, like we've seen today. And I think that I hope that there's still a place for people like us to explore the issues of what's going on in Gaza, and for everyone to do what they can. I'm a tour guide, so I can give a virtual tour to Gaza, which might in some small way help, then go ahead and do that. But I hope that's not done at the expense of real voices coming out of Gaza. Seek out Gazans themselves. There's some incredible people living in Gaza that I've been lucky enough to meet and talk to online, but it's not always easy. So that's what I would encourage you to do. And there's many resources that we can share to do that. search out, for example, the story of Muhammad Asaf, who was the first winner of Arab Idol. He came from Gaza. Search out the story of Majd Mashwari. She's an incredible young woman who invented concrete cinder blocks made out of rubble and does incredible engineering works in Gaza. There's also a really great organization called We Are Not Numbers, which I encourage you all to check out, which is run by Gazan people to exactly kind of go against what we're doing today, talking about percentages and statistics and saying there's actually people with real lives here who are, affected by this stuff, and you can, hear their stories. We've briefly worked with, different Gazan tour guides as well. So I encourage you to check out the other work that we've done. For example, just a few weeks ago, we did an online tour with the Israeli organization Gisha. So I definitely encourage you to check out their work. We also have, recording of that event that we did together. And we also have a part-time tour guide who's given these tours with us as well, and has written a book about his experience growing up in Gaza. And I can also provide a link to that. Perhaps there, as you can share a link of resources. Is that possible with everyone, that we can kind of continue the conversation going?
Thank you. Yes, for everyone who registered the event, which everyone here has, tomorrow we'll be sending out a list of different resources along with a recording of this virtual tour that people can reference as a resource. And yeah, there are so many different places to look. One of my favorites is, I mentioned the Stylex in advance of the tour. There's a documentary called Slingshot Hip Hop that features hip hop and rap groups, teenage groups in Gaza over the last decades and the culture that's emerged. Anthony Bourdain did an episode of his show in Gaza, and is actually a wonderful introduction that touches upon the dynamics and the culinary experience of the sea, living by the sea in Gaza. So very many different resources. And with that, Alex, I want to really, really thank you. Highlight again how valuable it is to have this experience and attend such a tour. For myself, also, though I live in Israel, Palestine, and relatively active in justice circles and advocacy and activist communities, the images we get from Gaza are so much disproportionately of catastrophe and horror, and those images are important when we want to reckon with the magnitude and scale of the violence that's being perpetrated. But just to have these images of daily life, just to see the cars driving through the squares on the boulevard that were depicted in the videos you showed, pictures of people praying during services in the mosques and churches, of the sea and the scribbles and graffitis on the walls. It's so striking to me that I've so rarely seen images like that almost anywhere. And again, thank you for highlighting the ways that though Israel denies responsibility so often, it is its military that controls the borders, the goods coming in and out of Gaza, how people are allowed to travel, freedom of movement, and is also actively engaged in a very cold calculus around what's allowed in and out based on security, as part of a larger project of occupation and separation, segregation, and fracturing of Palestinian society in an attempt to maximize Israeli control. So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. Thanks again for the invaluable perspective. And thanks to everyone here sincerely for joining this virtual tour. As I mentioned at the start of our time, we depend on contributions from you, our wider community, to cover the costs of our events, to sustain our work to combat the violence of occupation and shift the discourse around Israel-Palestine towards equality, justice, and democracy. You can sustain our work for justice by joining many others and becoming a member of the Green Olive Collective at members.greenolivecollective.com/become a member, which I just put once more into the chat. You can become a member at any amount you want, starting at $6 per month, and we will donate 10% of annual membership contributions to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides healthcare for children in Gaza, in Khan Yunis, and is developing a pediatric cardiac surgery program along with the HRDF. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the Nakba this year and the 56th anniversary of the occupation of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, we are more determined than ever to work for justice. The crisis in Israel-Palestine has never been greater, as people here are aware, no doubt, and people on both sides of the Green Line are in profound need of change. The recently elected Israeli government is increasing home demolitions and expulsions, has launched military assaults in Gaza and Jenin, and we need everyone here to help raise the profile of the situation and to bring some hope in a circumstance in which it feels distant. We ask you to become subscription members in order to sustain our ongoing advocacy as we build a global community with all of you committed to human rights and the end of displacement. Your membership will allow us to grow as an advocacy center committed to a future beyond apartheid, partition, segregation, and occupation. It will directly support monthly solidarity visits to communities facing displacement in Area C of the West Bank, like Masaka Riata and the South Hebron Hills, and we help elsewhere, such as the Jordan Valley in the future. It will allow us to develop new tour guiding initiatives, highlighting the lived realities of Palestinians, and allow us to sustain global campaigns, encouraging people around the world to take action. It will also sustain the work of our incredible tour guides that I know many of you have met, and I see familiar faces here who have been with us on the ground. They are every day in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, and throughout the occupied West Bank, bringing people to see the reality with their own eyes, bear witness and hear testimonies from Palestinians, develop relationships with communities living under occupation, whose voices they can amplify in their home communities. Very lastly, your membership will allow us to create strategic advocacy resources, trainings, informational films and primers, and other publications and materials whose aim is to expose the larger international community to the reality on the ground, and engage in meaningful advocacy for the end of the occupation and the development of a democratic and just society. So with that, really, thank you everyone for joining. This was spectacular. We wish there was more time. We hope you have lovely, lovely days. And we're excited to engage and see you in the future for upcoming events. Stay posted and we'll send a recording of this tour and other resources to engage and learn about Gaza tomorrow. Thank you again, Alex. Have everyone lovely days and see you very soon.
Thank you very much, Erez. Peace to all.